Hello, and welcome to our presentation. If you've ever found yourself wondering how ESG factors affect firm valuation, you are in the right spot because we're going to take you through a case study of Danone and Saputo to understand how we adjust their cash flows to arrive at a valuation. I'm Amelia, and I will be taking you through our agenda. So we're going to start off with a discussion of ESG valuation methodology, the one we used and others we considered. Next, we'll take you through an overview of Danone and Saputo, as well as the industry that they operate in. Next, we'll combine the methodology and what we know about the firms to come up with a valuation. And then finally, we'll conclude with some limitations of our model and why this is important. So let's start off with that. Why is this important? Well, ESG factors materially affect firm operations, but firms aren't reporting on ESG factors in their regular financial reports. Second, there's no widely accepted valuation method. There are a few, and we picked one, but not every firm uses this. And finally, ESG factors really materially affect valuation. Our assumption was that financial markets are inefficient and they don't reflect public information, and that's generally consistent with the idea that firms with positive ESG profiles take longer term views, they have stronger competitive positions and lower downside risk, but those factors are really difficult to quantify. So our assumption was also that firms would, or the market would correct these factors in the future as society changes, as climate change gets worse. So let's talk about the methodologies that we looked at. There are three that we're going to overview. The first is the denominator of a discounted cash flow. It's the cost of capital. The second are the cash flows, so the numerators. And the third is a different valuation method in multiples. In the cost of capital, as the risk of systematic market shock decreases, the cost of capital decreases, and as a result, the valuation is higher. In cash flows, there are more future opportunities, lower downside risk, and that leads to higher profitability. And then in the multiple method, for good ESG firms, you add some sort of premium on top of the price to earnings or price to book multiple, and that also arrives at a higher valuation. In this analysis, we use the cash flow method because it's the most intuitive to investors and easiest to understand. So we looked at Danone, which was rated as low risk by Sustainalytics and as a leader by MSCI, and on the opposite end of the spectrum, Saputo, which was rated high risk by Sustainalytics and a laggard by MSCI. We'll review the industry that these two operate in the next section, so I'll pass it to Amanda.
So now I'm going to set the stage for the ESG valuation by first taking you through an overview of the industry and the companies that we've used for our analysis. So let's start with the dairy manufacturing industry, which consists of firms that manufacture a variety of dairy products. This is a large industry estimated at $119 billion in 2020, with modest growth of 2.6% from 2015 to 2020. Dairy producers sit squarely in the middle of the supply chain and are therefore exposed to value drivers from multiple stakeholders, including governments, dairy farmers, employees, and end consumers. In most developed countries, dairy industries are highly regulated, leading to high barriers to entry and a relatively fragmented global market. The dairy manufacturing industry is facing increasing pressure to minimize the effects that dairy production has on the environment. As well, consumer preference is shifting to look for dairy products that are healthier and that use less plastic packaging. ESG factors are growing in importance for all parts of the dairy industry supply chain. It starts with the dairy farmers who are working to reduce intensive farming, and then moves on to the dairy product manufacturers who are working to manage the carbon footprint of dairy products while also caring for the health and safety of their employees. Next, you have the end consumers who are focused on health, nutrition, and responsible product consumption. And then lastly, the government and all other stakeholders who are working to protect the domestic industries and the environment. So the two companies within the dairy manufacturing industry that we chose to focus on for our ESG valuation were Danone and Saputo. Danone is headquartered in Paris, France, and is split into three main business lines. Their essential dairy and product-based products, and their waters, and lastly, their specialized nutrition. though over 50% of their annual revenue comes from the essential dairy and plant-based product line. Danone is well recognized as a leader in sustainability, and in 2018, Danone entered the sustainability capital markets with a social bond and a sustainability-linked loan. Danone is rated as a sustainability leader by MSCI and as low risk by Sustainalytics. Saputo is one of the top global dairy producers headquartered in Montreal, Canada, and sells products globally. In early 2020, Saputo announced an extensive sustainability program with plans to invest 50 million Canadian over a 3-year period to meet its environmental goals. Saputo is rated as a sustainability laggard by MSCI and as a high-risk company by Sustainalytics.
To understand the effects of ESG factors on valuation, we first need to look at the ESG risks that Danone and Saputo are exposed to. MSCI identifies 7 such ESG factors. We believe that the first 5 are quantifiable. The probability and size of product recall are highly unpredictable, so we leave out product safety and quality. As for corporate governance, since both Danone and Saputo are leaders here, we leave this out for our comparative analysis. For each of these quantifiable factors, we find the financial impact on 3 cases: best case, base case, and worst case. For raw material sourcing and water stress, we find the financial impact on 3 global temperature rise scenarios, which are based on climate change simulations. For the best case, a 1.5 to 2 degree rise in temperature. For the base case, a 2.5 to 3.2 degree rise in temperature. And for the worst case, a 4.4 to 5 degree rise in temperature by the end of the 21st century. For product carbon footprint, we looked at carbon pricing policies changing with a low probability of change in the best case and a high probability of change in the worst case. For factors 4 and 5, we looked at customer adoption with high customer adoption in the best case and low customer adoption in the worst case. For each of these factors, we found the financial impact on cash flows. For raw material sourcing, we looked at 5 main raw materials: dairy, cane sugar, cocoa, soy, and palm oil. We found that as temperatures rise, the yield of all of these products reduces. As yield reduces, this increases the operating costs. For water stress, we looked at 2 factors: the scarcity of fresh or groundwater and how this scarcity affects adjacent elements like irrigation and manufacturing. We found that as water becomes more scarce, it adds pricing pressures and increases the operating costs. The dairy industry as a whole is a highly carbon intensive industry, which is very susceptible to changes in carbon taxes and carbon related policies and regulations. So as these regulations become more stringent in the worst case, the operating costs increase. Research has shown that customers have started to increase their consumption of products which are more nutritional and health-based. We believe that this customer shift to healthier option is an opportunity for Danone and Saputo to increase their operating income. Research has also shown that products with sustainable packaging claims sell more than products without. And we believe that this increase in sales accounts for roughly 2 to 4%. Now, while both Danone and Saputo are exposed to all of these risks, they take mitigation efforts to reduce the effect of these risks. We classify the mitigation efforts into 4 categories: strong, medium, weak, and none. Strong efforts lead to only 25% of residual risk being felt, versus medium has 50% residual risk, weak and none have 75 and 100 respectively. As you can see, Danone has taken very good mitigation efforts compared to Saputo. Danone has reduced its full scope carbon footprint by 24%. It is striving for 100% raw material traceability and has invested heavily in non-GMO fed cattle. It has reduced the dependence of its operations and manufacturing on water, and it has started multiple nutrition and health product lines. As for Saputo, it performs weakly on all the factors, and it has no water stress related mitigation efforts. As you can see, Danone has far lower residual risk compared to Saputo in material sourcing, water stress, and carbon footprint. On the other hand, it has higher residual opportunity compared to Saputo in nutrition and health and packaging. Now we incorporate these into our financial model by growing our operating costs by the aggregate effect of material sourcing, water stress, and carbon footprint, and growing our operating income by the aggregate effect of nutrition and health and packaging.
So how did this work in practice? In our case, we considered 3 FCF drivers: revenue growth, growth in operating costs, including COGS and SG&A, and also capital expenditures. To determine the precise impact on FCF, we followed a 4-step process. First, we used MSCI and Sustainalytics ratings to identify the most material and easily quantifiable issues for both companies. Second, we determined how in aggregate each material factor could affect our FCF drivers in 3 scenarios: best, base, and worst cases. Third, we adjusted our inputs to account for the expected risk mitigation efforts that Parth just described. And finally, we calculated a 5-year FCF projection and terminal value for each scenario and weighed our results by the expected probability of those scenarios. In this respect, we arrived at an implied enterprise value for both companies and then compared our results to Danone and Saputo's current stock prices. Now, in this slide, the assumption section on the top left is not unlike what we would have seen in Finance 1 or 2 last year. And the 3 graphs are simply sensitivity analyses per scenario that show if the stock in question is over or undervalued relative to intrinsic value. We see on this slide that Danone stock price is undervalued in all 3 cases. And going to the next slide, we see that Saputo stock is overvalued relative to intrinsic value in our base and worst cases, or base and worst cases, and undervalued in our best case.
So next, we'll look at how the assumptions and adjustments previously discussed actually impact our valuation. So the top row, or the actual prices, show the respective closing prices of Saputo and Danone. Looking first at Saputo, our base case and worst case scenarios show that the stock is currently overpriced relative to its intrinsic value and underpriced for only the best case scenario. In sharp contrast, Danone appears to be undervalued relative to its intrinsic value in all 3 scenarios. So an interesting takeaway here is that ESG risk and opportunity may very well play a role in valuations, as the badly ESG rated company Saputo appears to be overvalued and the well ESG rated company Danone appears to be undervalued. So a great next step would be to take this analysis and apply it to other examples of badly and well-rated companies across other industries to see if the same observations can be replicated elsewhere. So to conclude, we'll just wanted to share some of our limitations of our analysis. So first, in looking to some of the valuation inputs, the long-term growth rate and cost of capital that were calculated were based on macroeconomic, firm-specific, and industry factors. While we believe that residual ESG risk may affect a firm's long-term growth rate, we did not account for this in our analysis and believe it to be outside of the scope of this project. Next, we believe that a thorough environmental scenario analysis would have helped our valuation by providing additional insight into climate change and the likelihood of the impact of certain ESG risks or opportunities for the 2 firms. And finally, converting the MSCI risk and opportunity factors into quantifiable adjustments for the model required extensive research. There's really no simple, generally accepted conversion of what it means to be an ESG laggard in one area into a valuation model adjustment factor. So this really required a fair amount of judgment on our part. And just to conclude, our analysis highlights some of the many challenges associated with factoring ESG risks into firm valuation. These challenges may indicate why financial markets are not able to easily factor these ratings into stock prices. But nonetheless, we believe this is a great area for continued research and analysis. Thank you for listening.